going to summarize our, all in all, 21 days sort of odyssey around most of Syria's neighbors. I was first in Lebanon for a week before Jeff joined me in Turkey. All in all, we met with, we went to, Turkey, then Jordan, and then to Israel. All in all, we met with the opposition, both armed and civilian, as well as officials in all 4 countries, representatives of UN and Syrian aid agencies, and U.S. embassy officials. It is our most comprehensive visit to the Syrian border regions to date, and I believe the most comprehensive of any Washington-based research organization that I know of. A big thanks to the Washington Institute for supporting our work. We couldn't do it without you. And a big thanks also to Jeff White himself, a great guy to travel with and a top-notch analyst who helped me make better assessments of the conflict as our trip unfolded, which is not always one of my strong suits. In short, the view from neighboring states is that Syria is melting down, or what I would call Chernobyling, and it's spilling over its borders. Contrary to the view in Washington, I believe the conflict is less and less containable, and I think that the meetings we had there, both with civilians and officials, bear that out. More assertive action by Washington is needed to arrest Syria's descent into a failed state and to try and shape a post-Assad Syria, or increasingly Syria's. Okay, to get to Patrick's original concern in Lebanon, I'm a firm believer in going where the action is. There's no sense in staying back. And try to do that safely is always a challenge. The look at the conflict from Lebanon until now, the policy has been of dissociation from the conflict by the McCarthy government. But that is getting harder and harder to maintain. The conflict is spilling over Lebanon's border into Syria. And most importantly, and on this trip, I made a visit to the North Bekaa, and specifically the village of Arsal. And it was a few days before where Lebanese military intelligence slaying of Khalid Hamayed, a Lebanese citizen who's a major supporter of the Free Syrian Army, led residents to chase down some of his killers and to kill at least 2 of them nearby the village. Arsal is a Sunni village in the North Bekaa where Shia are prevalent, as well as other Christian communities. And it's really there that you begin to feel that the Syria conflict has already spilled over the border and, as Patrick mentioned, spills back in from Lebanon. Hezbollah is openly operating across the border areas south of the Syrian town of Qusair. Right now, the Free Syrian Army, which is largely Sunni, is laying siege to a regime depot at a place called Meshtel Azra. It's those members from the Sunni community of Arsal in Lebanon that are assisting in that siege. And the regime is desperate to keep control of that base because it supplies many other bases in the general area. The reason why this is strategically important is that corridor from the Bekaa going north through Qusair and up to the west of Homs allows Hezbollah-dominated areas of Lebanon to be contiguous with the areas where the Syrian regime is the strongest. And it's in that area north of, around Qusair, where you have a mixture of Shia villages as well as some Sunni villages as well. And I think that it's natural that the conflict would flare up there at this time. Previously, a lot of the cross-border incidents and where most of the tension was actually in northern Lebanon, whether it's in the Wadi Khalid pocket or to the west towards Tripoli. Now we see it in this particular area, and I don't think it's going to let up anytime soon. Members of, a number of Lebanese leaders with whom I met are really worried about what's going on in Syria. They're worried not just because of the spillover into Lebanon and how that's going to affect the upcoming elections there, but also about the fate of their individual communities, their sectarian communities within Syria as well, as the war broadens. And I think here that their individual communications with their brethren across the border will be increasingly key to dealing with this crisis as it unfolds. Overall, I think that the visit to Lebanon helped me understand, though, that in the upcoming elections in Lebanon, ironically, I don't find March 14th or its individual parties making a serious bid to challenge Hezbollah in the upcoming elections, which I thought was kind of surprising. It seemed as if the deliberations over the elections law, which were long and I think oftentimes tedious, were not then followed up with a concerted effort to try and dislodge Hezbollah from government. Maybe that's wise at this point. Maybe it's better to sort of sit this one out, or to keep it at arm's distance, to make sure that the conflict does not spread within Lebanon from Syria. The view from Turkey is increasingly complicated. Refugee flows are up, but I think most importantly, and this follows on my last trip to Syrian border regions in November, the number of displaced Syrians internally along Turkey's frontier with Syria has gone up dramatically. And it's in there where the recent discussions in the press have talked about the humanitarian aspects of this, and the fact that aid is not making its way into liberated areas of Syria. And liberated areas of Syria here are those that are dominated by the Free Syrian Army and its individual affiliates. There are a lot of reasons for this. The international aid system does not deal very well with providing aid into areas that are not controlled by the sovereign power. And the Assad regime still represents, in the international community, the primary legal body through which the international aid agencies channel assistance, and that includes the United Nations, the ICRC, and the Red Cross organizations, and so on. The problem is, in discussions with a number of these officials, the distribution of aid in regime areas in the south is markedly better than those areas in the north, even along the frontier, the somewhat open frontiers with Turkey. And there's a real discussion within the aid community about how to best address this going forward. Overall, I think the biggest shift that I noticed, especially even from late November, was a marked shift to the right among the Syrian rebels within Syria and those that were coming out of Syria, in the direction of Salafists and jihadist elements. Also, there was a marked growth in anger at the United States and President Obama himself. And this particularly is tied to the series of stories that came out most recently concerning the White House's veto of a plan to arm the rebels. And these stories have leaked out over the last couple of months. The Syrian opposition is very cognizant of that, and as are the neighboring countries who are increasingly trying to deal with this meltdown. The discussion in Ankara is interesting because previously discussions there that they've had over the last year or so have mostly dealt with to arm or not to arm and to what degree and whom. I think right now Turkey, and I think also to an extent Jordan and Israel, would like the U.S. to take more assertive action, and particularly from Ankara, they would like the U.S. to lead a coalition to get rid of Assad. So I think they're kind of resigned to the fact that, okay, the United States is not going to provide the kind of weapons that they would like to get Assad out of power, but they don't want the United States to stand in the way, and they would like them to lead a coalition. When I asked them why, when I said, why don't you just do it on your own? I mean, you certainly have enough weapons to be able to do that. What was interesting, and this was more or less across the board, there was a recognition among the allies of the opposition that they have too many competing interests and too many different clients within the country. So some sort of concerted action is constrained, while the regime has the real benefit of being backed by fewer parties. And here we're talking about the Iran-Hezbollah dimension, as well as Russia. So it's easier for the regime to maintain the discipline of its alliance, but for the Sunni powers in the region, it's increasingly difficult. And also in Ankara, I found, and this is throughout Turkey as well, there was increasing worry about the Kurdish issue spreading across the border, and there were a lot of questions about the recent movement of Salafist and other extremist groups across the border from Turkey to attack targets within Syria. The exact details of this are a bit murky, but there were a lot of questions, both by analysts as well as observers, about how that could occur without Turkish intelligence knowing about it, and why that would be occurring. And particularly here, we'll point to the battle at Ras Al Ain, which Jeff may be talking about, and we can talk about in the question session. From Jordan, it's an even more complicated picture. In the last 60 days alone, 100,000 refugees have streamed across the border from Syria into the Hashemite kingdom. Jeff and I visited the Zaatari refugee camp, which I think a number of you have seen in the press, whose residents now represent Jordan's sixth largest city. There has been a recent rash of unrest in the camp, and when you go into the camp and you visit with Syrians, they're well provided for in terms of the basics, but there's no basic security within the camp. There is security around it, increasingly the UNHCR was having a hard time dealing with the situation there. Right now, the Jordanian-Syrian border is among the world's most dangerous, according to UN officials. And the reason why is that the Syrian regime and the Shabiha are actually just openly murdering Syrian refugees as they attempt to cross the border from Syria into Jordan. The Jordanian armed forces have been quietly responding, and I think you'll notice in the press there have been a number of deaths which have resulted from that action. If the current rates continue, about 770,000 Syrian refugees will be in Jordan by June 1st, which approximately represents 15% of the Hashemite Kingdom's population. And this is without the battle for Damascus really kicking off yet. And that's a real concern by international agencies. They believe that a number of refugees will stream south, and there are real questions about how those refugees will be cared for if and when they're able to cross the border. Perhaps most disturbingly, and I think Jeff will be talking about this as well, is the rapid growth of Jabhat al-Nusra and other Salafist groups now active in the Daraa province and the Haran in general. This includes along the Israeli frontier as well. So, and I think this was not just borne out by analysts we spoke with, but also by officials that briefed us privately as well. And in here, I'm broadly summarizing in order to keep things relatively confidential. From Israel, there was a marked change in concern about the number of cross-border incidents which have occurred over the last few months. But the largest concern to date is about the transfer of strategic weapons from the regime to Hezbollah in Lebanon, as well as their inadvertent transfer, perhaps, and these kind of weapons falling outside the hands of the regime and to extremist elements that may be taking over large swaths of Syria as the Assad regime gives way. These strategic weapons include chemical, surface-to-surface missiles, and sophisticated anti-aircraft systems. I think the biggest takeaway from my trip to Israel is the degree of worry about the de facto failed state which they're now staring into across the Golan frontier, and all the potential incidents go along with it. So I think that we can look at the incidents over the last few days with both the disappearance of a Canadian UNDOF official, and then later the capture of this group of 20 UNDOF representatives within Syrian territory, as increasing concern that the ability for the international community and the UN in general to deal with this and to guarantee security across the Golan frontier is increasingly called into question. In the words of one person we met in Israel, who is well positioned to observe and to speak on behalf of the government, Syria's meltdown and its implications are perhaps the most complicated challenge that Israel and the IDF has ever faced. And for a country that's faced a lot of challenges, I found that to be a very bold statement. In terms of conclusions, before I hand things over to Jeff and to Simon, it's hard to see how the recent announcement of food and medical supplies to the armed opposition will help to take down Assad, the Assad regime more quickly, although it should impact the provision of aid inside of areas under opposition control, and we should welcome that. And I think until recently, the line that the Obama administration drew in terms of only dealing with civilians and not dealing with armed groups in any capacity constrained our ability to provide assistance into those areas and also to play soft power cards. I was glad to see that was reconsidered, but again, I don't think it's enough. The real question at this point is if the administration will support allies arming the Syrian opposition via the Syrian coalition, or what we call SOC here in Washington, and its armed affiliate, the Supreme Military Council. And what will those weapons be? U.S. food and medical assistance also alone, are unlikely to shift the opinions and the activities of rebels who are looking increasingly to the right, to Salafists and extremists. And I think it's also unlikely to arrest the rapid decline in America's standing within Syria in the region as a whole. Major drawback of Washington's current approach, I think, is that relying on assistance funneled via SOC and the SMC will ensure that the United States will be unable to influence trends among those that are on the ground within Syria. And here we're talking particularly about armed groups. I think that using the SMC and SOC as a cutout is something that's convenient, but given that I don't see a political settlement in sight via the UN or any other agreement between Russia and the United States, I think that directly influencing groups on the ground, armed groups in particular, is best. The fact is that that SOC and the SMC continue to lack the penetration among those armed groups. And this is important politically going forward. As I think you've heard from this podium for the last 8 months, my mantra, because those that are taking the shots against Assad will be calling them in the liberated areas of Syria once he is gone. There is still time to influence a post-Assad Syria, as Assad, as you can see, has failed to step aside, despite the fact that his forces have been pushed out of large swaths of the Syrian territory. The best way to do that is by directly providing lethal and non-lethal assistance to vetted groups within the Syrian opposition. I was encouraged by Secretary Kerry's comments in the region the last few days that seem to leave that open as a possibility. The sooner that this happens, the better we will be able, going forward, to contain the Syrian crisis and to shape a better future for its people. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks to the Institute, Patrick and company, for letting me go on the trip. And special thanks to Andrew, who's the best companion ever for a trip to the Middle East. Knows the languages, knows the people, knows everybody. He knows more people in the Middle East than I know people. So, very great guy to have, with you on any kind of trip like this. I thought what I do is actually pass on to you some of my observations on the military situation, kind of what I heard, and what kind of sense I tried to make out of those. Some of this may be surprising. Some of it'll maybe just represent reinforcement of things we already sort of know and understand. But it's nice to actually hear it and see it on the ground out there instead of from a few thousand miles away. First observation I would make is that numbers remain elusive, and here I'm talking about numbers of FSA personnel and numbers of FSA units. I asked the questions repeatedly to the commanders and people that should know the answers out there, but you could never get a straight answer about numbers of people or numbers of units. Units were described as many. Personnel of units were given, the numbers were given were widely variable, from 80 or 60 to 20,000 in the Liwa al-Islam Brigade. So very great variation in numbers. No two units that we talked to were alike in terms of size, makeup, command, types of weapons they had. So all of these Katiba and Liwa are of the by themselves. They're all unique in a sense. Which says a lot about I think the rebellion and its effectiveness. One question I've been trying to get at is what's the actual effect of attrition on rebel forces? Are they able to replace people they lose in combat? How does that whole system work? The one piece of information I got on that was interesting is we talked to one commander, one large Katiba in the Jebel Zawiya area, and he said his unit had declined from 1,600 men to 1,160 men over the course of fighting basically in the past few months or so. So suggests there is some significant attrition on rebel forces. Another observation is that the fighting is the basis of political legitimacy and power. If you're not in the fight, if you don't engage in battle with the regime forces, you are not a factor politically inside Syria. It's part of this marginalization process of the political activists. It's the guys on the ground with the guns, as Andrew was saying earlier, that are actually exercising political power. There was criticism by some of the activists that we talked to that the military councils and units try to control everything. They exercise actual political power, social power within their areas and are marginalizing the political activists. That may or may not be a good trend depending upon who the military guys are. One thing we heard very clearly while we were out there was that the Islamists are the most important component of the rebel forces. They are the vanguard of the armed revolution. Like it or not, and partially due to U.S. and other countries' failed policies, I think this is what we're hearing out there, and this is the reality, in fact, on the ground. One activist said, quote, Islam is the main motivator for fighting. You can see the Islamists are the best fighters. He was an Islamist, so that might be what he was saying. But I also happen to think it's true. We hear from a number of other sources. Islamist units were described as having cohesion, discipline, effective command structures, effective leaders, high combat spirit, and a cause. And basically, if you're in a military organization, that's what you want your units to have, right? You want your units to have all those things, and the Islamist units have those things, at least some of them. The more secular units, whatever, not so much. At least this is what we heard. The Islamist units, and especially JN, want to be on the front line. They want to fight. They want to attack. They don't like commanders that won't fight. We got one story about a unit, an Islamist unit, that had its commander removed because he wasn't active enough. He didn't want to fight enough. So the personnel in the unit went above him and said, give us a new commander. This guy won't fight. They conduct civil action type programs. They provide food to the people. They clean up the streets. They do a number of those kinds of actions. In fact, in some areas in Aleppo, like one journalist described to me, one of the most important objectives of the JN and Islamist fighters in the area is to take control of the grain silos and secure the food supply, because that food is power, in these areas. JM was described as highly professional organization, doing everything in a professional military sense. One problem, though, that was described for JN was that, and this is a quote, is that everybody wants to do a suicide bombing. So it's that again. This is also coming from an Islamist type guy, but it's it's suggestive of the nature of of JN and these Islamist units. And the other thing we heard from a number of different types of people is that support for JN and the other Islamist fighting groups is growing, and that rebels are leaving the more moderate, secular, whatever groups to join those with arms and that are doing the fighting. So all these are bad trends, in a sense, at least from the U.S. standpoint. On command and control is a big issue. How are these units actually operating together? Where's the planning done? Where's the direction coming from? We heard that there's wide variance in the command and control relationships among the various kinds of types of units out there. Command and control is described as tight in jihadist units. Again, this is something you actually want if you're in a wartime situation. One quote we got about JN was, if the emir tells them to crawl, they crawl. These guys actually exercise true command and control over their units. Again, it's in contrast to other kinds of units. A senior military committee official we talked to from one of the provinces, we asked him why the rebels are fighting well. He said that they have a high degree of motivation. There's growing numbers of heavy weapons in their hands and increasing military experience. And he was applying this across the board, not just to the Islamist groups, but that was his view. We got a little bit on problems within the FSA. One Katiba commander we talked to, he described tensions between civilians and military in the opposition. and between jihadists and nationalists is causing, kind of a continuous turmoil, within the rebel armed forces, or not, maybe turmoil is too strong, but continuous ripples of discontent or whatever within the armed rebels. He said the regime has penetrated a number of the Katiba, a number of the battalions, and tries to get them to work against one another. His quote was, "When I go in, I have no risk from regime forces. I have risk from the FSA." In other words, his personal concern was that he would be attacked or something by other FSA units, more so than the regime. He said that the goal of the rebellion has changed from freedom and democracy to an Islamic state. Again, backing up what Andrew said earlier. He asked, in a sense, or stated that what they needed was one country to provide full support, rather than a whole bunch of countries supporting, specific groups that they back for their own reasons. Amongst combat units that we contacted, there was universal antipathy towards the United States, the West, and the international community. They want weapons and they want money, but paradoxically, they believe that those who receive it from other sources are somehow controlled by their sources. So the groups we talked to wanted money, wanted weapons, but they thought that other groups that were receiving money and weapons, somehow they were controlled by them. Conspiracy theories were dominant or prevalent in the region. I think we heard multiple times that the U.S., Israel, and Iran are cooperating somehow to either kill the rebellion or stall the rebellion. And it's funny in a sense. I used to say that in the Middle East they think the X-Files is a documentary, but these attitudes seem to be strongly held. These perceptions of a giant conspiracy working against the rebellion don't seem to be just something they toss off lightly. It seems to be part of the basis for their behavior, and that's probably not a good thing for us. There are definitely shortages and maldistribution of weapons and ammunition amongst the rebel units, and this is limiting their effectiveness. It interferes with their ability to conduct and sustain operations. It accounts in part for this sort of pulse or impulse aspect of the armed rebellion. You see a lot of action, then a slowdown, then a lot of action. Part of that's just due to this maldistribution of weapons and ammunition. Logistics and planning are sort of negotiated, rather than provided or organized. Right, these groups, they trade ammunition, they trade weapons, they sell the stuff back and forth. They bargain over if they're going to take a base, what the percentage of the weaponry or ammunition taken is going to go to each group. So it's nothing like an established logistic system. It's very ad hoc and kind of on the fly, and it does affect their combat capabilities. It makes them less capable than they could be if things are better organized. Talk just a little bit about the importance of the war in the South, because we did spend some time in Jordan talking to people that are knowledgeable. And by South, I mean largely Dara province, but also Quneitra province to some extent. What we heard was that 50% of the villages in Dara province are represented in Za'atari camp. And there's a lot of villages, right? And it gives you an idea of the scope of the fighting inside Dara province. That many places are generating refugees. The refugee flow is in fact one indicator of the level of the fighting. As the fighting goes up, more refugees basically head south. We heard some concern about the increasing numbers and combat role of the jihadists and Salafists in Dara province. This has not generally been thought of as being a hotbed for these kind of organizations, but there was concern expressed that JN in particular is growing, had maybe 300 combat personnel in Dara province, and that they were taking on an increasingly large role in leading the fighting there. Andrew talked about the dangers on the Jordanian-Syrian border. And what you have, especially on the Syrian side, is that the border is a war zone between the FSA and the regime army, and they fight for control of the border, and they fight for control of the border crossings. And the refugees get caught up in some of that fighting, and the refugees are also directly targeted, by the regime. There was a definite expectation. We heard it from several different people in Jordan that there of an expectation of heavier fighting in the Damascus area. That the fighting that had occurred, in the last few weeks or a couple of weeks ago was just a preliminary to a still heavier round of fighting in Damascus. And there was a sense that, quote, something big is coming for Dara in the southern part of Syria. Refugee push factors. This is interesting. We got this from the UN people. What they see as pushing refugees into Jordan was, a lack of medical care and medicine. And we also heard this from a doctor who was, trying to get back into Syria with medical supplies. A lack of fuel, because it's been winter, cold, miserable conditions. Lack of food. The level of violence of the fighting pushes refugees. And in general, a security vacuum. In many areas of the South, neither the FSA nor the regime provides basic security, basic policing, basic personal security. It's just kind of a no man's land. There's also as a general observation, the war is highly regionalized or localized. The war is different depending upon the province you're at, and even within provinces, the war can be a quite different thing. In a sense, there are micro wars going on, urban wars, rural wars. People are cutting individual deals. Individual FSA commanders are making arrangements with local regime commanders for ceasefires, for exchange of prisoners. To get people out of prison and so on. So the picture of the war inside Syria is not a big hand, small map kind of thing. It's a very the war is very specialized or particularized, depending on the area. A few comments on the regime situation. The regime remains cohesive and capable of acting. Right? It is not cracked yet. It is not broken. It's part of the reason for this, as one senior military committee member told us, was the regime is getting arms shipments from its allies, very importantly from Russia and Iran and some from Hezbollah. It still enjoys sectarian or minority support. It's in his mind, it still had powerful military forces. He believed that the commanders of military units are implicated in the crimes of the regime and therefore are sticking with it. And he saw this increasing role that Andrew talked about of Hezbollah directly in the fighting, but also in Iran in terms of, supporting with ammunition and so on and directing the fighting. He gave us a story about Aleppo, saying that in the battle for Aleppo city, they are listening to Hezbollah and Iranian communications, in the appropriate dialects, languages, and so on. So they're hearing these guys. I did have a discussion with one analyst who is looking at the Syrian Army and what's happening to it, and he's done a study on the funeral data on Syrians being killed in the fighting. According to his data, there are 40 killed per day in the regime forces. 2 to 3 times that additional in wounded and unable to return to duty. So in his view, the army was exhausting itself. Over time, this is kind of the same thing I had been saying for quite a while. One of the keys to the regime staying around and hanging on, though, is that the regime has created large numbers of irregular and auxiliary forces. And the regime is transferring a lot of the military and operational security responsibilities to these auxiliary and irregular forces, and to the Hezbollah, which is helping them a lot, as Andrew indicated. So with that, I just wrap it up and respond to any questions. Thank you all.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I've got a presentation here which includes a few slides which I hope will serve to keep you awake and indeed to make you slightly jealous of the trips that I've been able to do courtesy of the Washington Institute. My contribution to the presentation and discussion today is to talk about the perspectives of the conservative Arab states of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman. These are countries I deal with on a daily basis, but my perspectives today are enhanced because I was in the Gulf twice in February. On my first trip, I visited Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, the three largest emirates of the seven-member UAE. And on my second trip, I did a circle: Dubai, Qatar, Bahrain, Abu Dhabi, and back to Dubai. On both trips, Syria was a central part of the conversations I had with officials, diplomats, and military officers. But the other items topping people's agendas were as important: what is happening in Egypt, Iran's nuclear program, and what is US policy. The Gulf states have different views on these issues. There are areas of overlap, but also wide differences. I will outline these views and pinpoint the challenges for US policy. But first, to illustrate the setting of my conversations, I didn't send any postcards during my travels, but these few slides reflect why the views of the Gulf states, most of which are very small, increasingly loom so large in Middle East policy discussions. They are very rich, have spare cash, a strong sense of their Islamic identity, and want to have a role. They are also very competitive with each other. First slide. This is the Burj Khalifa, the Khalifa Tower in Dubai. It is the world's tallest building. Dubai is coming out of its financial crisis of 3 years ago and is booming. Next slide. This is the Museum of Islamic Art in Qatar. The building was designed by I.M. Pei and is fabulous. Through the arches, across the bay, is the skyline of Doha, the capital. Next slide. This is the courtyard of the Grand Mosque in Abu Dhabi, a building which the Emiratis like to show visitors because they are proud of what they regard as their strong but also moderate Islamic identity. Next slide. And finally, back to Dubai, the commercial capital of the UAE and the iconic city-state. The origins of its prosperity lie 3 miles to the north of this photo. Dubai Creek, where dhows and other small ships are still loaded with goods destined for Iran. Turning, though, to Syria. As Arab states, the GCC countries are anguished by the daily graphic news reports of suffering. As Gulf states, the GCC countries also fear Iran and view the overthrow of Bashar Assad as a likely strategic setback for Tehran. But then one quickly has to take into account the nuances and the differences between these countries. Both Saudi Arabia and Qatar are supporting the Syrian opposition with money and weapons, but they are in competition with each other for influence. Doha, I suspect, senses an additional opportunity, given the increased feebleness of King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia and Crown Prince Salman. Doha, little Qatar, 150,000, maybe 200,000 citizens, wants to be a world-class player. In supplying weapons, both Saudi Arabia and Qatar have fewer scruples than the US and Western countries, and they are probably supplying them to jihadi groups which we would not want to be part of a new government in post-Assad Syria. It seems that the competitive instinct between Doha and Riyadh is stronger than the sense of responsibility for the shape of the outcome. Also, Qatar's willingness to confront Iran is almost certainly constrained by the fact that more than any other GCC state, it has to deal with Iran on a daily basis. Qatar's wealth comes from its offshore North Field natural gas reservoir. This field is contiguous with Iran's offshore South Pars natural gas field. They are, to make it clear, one and the same reservoir. Qatar's willingness, therefore, to poke Iran in the eye is much less than that of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Qatar is even more Qatar is even more easily identifiable as the odd man out in relation to Egypt. Doha is pouring money into Cairo, both in terms of budgetary support and, if you believe some people, suitcases of cash to fund the Muslim Brotherhood and its leaders. The UAE takes a particularly dim view of Qatar's activities in Egypt, and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain probably share the UAE perspectives on this, that is Egypt, as well as its attitudes towards Iran. The old way of looking at the GCC states was that they formed a grouping to stand up to Iran and Saddam Hussein's Iraq. For decades it has worked well, even after the demise of Saddam. But since the start of the so-called Arab Spring, the GCC has been becoming involved in the events of the rest of the Arab world. Qatar and the UAE intervened in Libya. Now Saudi Arabia and Qatar are in Syria, and Qatar is in Egypt. It's hard to work out all the angles of the question, why is all this happening? I personally think that the competitive rivalries between the GCC states are crucial, but a common answer I heard in the Gulf from the GCC states themselves was that it was because of the lack of US leadership. It seems that these Gulf countries are determined to do something because they perceive that Washington is not doing enough. Syria combines the issues which dominate Gulf thinking: the rise of political Islam, Iran, and the suffering of fellow Arabs. What I fear is that by the time Bashar Assad eventually falls, the differences between the GCC states will be so wide that the grouping will no longer be united against Iran, nor an effective ally of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Well, the great privilege that I get from moderating this event is that I get to ask the first question. And so I was intrigued that, as far as I could tell, neither Jeff nor Simon mentioned the SOC, which is so central to Washington's thinking about the situation in Syria. And Washington places such importance on the ability of the opposition to come together and to unify, and a lot of attention on its relationship with the external leadership of the opposition. And Andrew mentioned them at the end of his remarks to suggest that they don't matter very much. And I would be interested in you expounding on what your interlocutors had to say about the SOC, if anything, and what role it plays in their thinking about Syria's, the current fighting in Syria, and about Syria's future. Please answer from the podium so we can capture this for our live stream.
Jeff, would you like to go first?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I'll add in.
Yeah, just maybe to give a bit of context and to allow, and then Simon and Jeff to answer directly. The the Syrian coalition is something that we would like to function, right? And there's a lot of hopes pinned to it. But the Syrian coalition is an umbrella organization. Inside of it is another umbrella organization. And as you know, it's hard to open up two umbrellas underneath each other at the same time. And what I mean by that is the Syrian National Council is the first umbrella organization. It was the precursor to SOC. And it includes an amalgamation of the Muslim Brotherhood, Salafists, and liberal independents. And as you know, it's completely dysfunctional, mostly for individual reasons. And then after that, the creation in Qatar last November of the Syrian coalition was designed to water down the Syrian National Council's influence and to increase that influence from those inside the country. Well, that didn't happen. We'd like it to happen here in Washington, but it didn't happen. Instead, the Syrian National Council maintained its position, more or less, and all the dysfunction that goes along with it. And then we're told, well, it has more influence from inside. But if you look very closely, it has 14 representatives from local councils within Syria. Okay, so automatically alarm bells went off in my head because these 14 representatives were supposedly from each muhafaza, which is the equivalent of which is called a province, or the equivalent of a state in the United States, right? So by definition, if I told you I'm the local council representative from Pennsylvania, it already sounds a little bit like it doesn't really deal with what's actually going on the ground. These members were not elected, okay? They were selected by the Qataris largely, okay? And so what happened is that those individuals, combined with a number of other notables within the country, they were not selected in any kind of way from the ground up. They're also mostly elderly. And this is a problem, not in all cases. In some cases, you have members who have quite a bit of notoriety, right? Muaz al-Khatib is, I think, well respected. Riyad Saif is also well respected. But most of the people who are taking down the Assad regime right now are under 30 years old, from that youth bulge that occurred after the Hama massacre in 1982. And quite frankly, they're the ones who are going to be calling the shots in Syria. And so this is one of the reasons why I think they don't really come up that much when you're in Syrian border regions, because they're not really that much of a factor. The Supreme Military Council, its armed affiliate, was explained to us, as even from members who are inside of it, as an organization that doesn't function. Why doesn't it function? Well, it's partially a product of SOC, but mostly it's because it was just not armed. Arms were not provided via the Supreme Military Council. Now, whether that's changed or not, we'll have to wait and see. So it wasn't armed, and people either went over to the extremists or they reverted back to the Provincial Military Council model, which was previously set up by the Qataris to supply weapons inside of Syria. So that gives the context for that question, I think.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the military side of that. There's no indication at all that I can see that the SMC exercises any kind of command or real military influence on the ground. The war inside Syria is being directed by, in some cases, by military councils, perhaps in Aleppo, in the Damascus area, and Dar ez-Zor, or by brigades or combinations of brigades or collectives of units. You just don't get any feel at all that there's any overall direction, any guidance, any shaping of the war coming from the SMC. It's a local war.
Simon?
My conversations in Doha didn't extend to the political leadership. They were very much concerned only in the outcome, and they saw the outcome as being a military-driven exercise, and so it was a question of supplying support, a term which I took to mean both money and arms.
Okay, so much for the central role of the SOC. Please, Daniel. And if you could wait for the microphone so that our live streamers can hear you.
Daniel, sir, we're from Johns Hopkins SAIS. At the risk of repeating Patrick's question, Muaz al-Khatib is supposed to appoint a prime minister in a couple of days. Will that make any difference, the formation of the provisional government?
It's a very good question. Will the movement and the external organization of SOC into some kind of transitional government, will that really make a difference to the fighting on the ground? I don't think it will, again, unless there something is provided to the groups on the ground that are conducting the fighting that either assist in taking down Assad or deal with the effects of the fighting itself. I think external organization is encouraged. The risk, though, is that if there's too much of a disconnect between the two, it becomes like Potemkin organization of the Syrian opposition, and I think that's what we really risk. I do think that that going along these lines, forming the right committees, forming this government in exile, I think these are steps in the right direction. I don't think that they are something that is originating out of the Syrian opposition itself. I think it's something that they're being encouraged to do by external parties. It doesn't really matter in the end, I guess, but the effectiveness of that organization, I think, will depend on will Syrians be able to work together within this new structure? What will be the incentives that will be provided to them to work together? And how will that help us bring about an emerging political entity in a post-Assad Syria? My sense is at the moment, and a lot of work, we're going to be devoting a lot of work to this, that the fighting is so localized that really we're looking at different leaders on the equivalent of the township level inside of Syria. All right, so which means that trying to get all of those leaders to agree and to come together and agree on even common principles, I think is going to be very, very difficult. And I don't know how SOC and what their exact plan is to do that at the moment.
Thank you. Mark. Microphone behind you.
Hi, Mark Ginsberg, Legalina Productions. This is to any of you, but probably Andrew, and by the way, you're to be commended for the incredible work that you've done on this over the last couple of years, Andrew. The proxy war that is being waged involves Iran and the Revolutionary Guards. It also involves the support to al-Nusra and the exterior support that's coming to it. What extent are you able to decipher how much Iran has poured in and will continue to pour in to prevent Assad from falling, number one? Number two, although I have my own preconceived notions, where do you believe al-Nusra is getting most of its support from at this point in time, and why?
Iran and Hezbollah are directly and extensively involved in this conflict by every indicator. Whether it's direct vignettes from fighters who tell you that they've captured Iranian ID cards in the fight, or whether it's the accounts of Hezbollah funerals. And I think there was a very good article in the New Yorker by Dexter Filkins that outlines a little bit of this. As well as, frankly, you just go to the North Bekaa, you can see Hezbollah rockets pointed, ironically, northward towards Qusair, right? So all of those indicators tell me that Iran and Hezbollah are directly involved in trying to prop up Assad. It's a major factor in the reason why Assad's able to hold on, right? And that it combined with, and maybe Jeff will want to go into a little bit about what we heard in terms of things that Iran is supplying militarily to Syria, but you know they're able to keep the Assad regime firing and to maintain the current situation where we expect somehow the Syrian rebels to run into regime gunfire until the regime runs out of bullets. To steal a line from Charlie Wilson's War. Jabhat al-Nusra, what I think is happening, and it's very murky. Quite frankly, Jabhat al-Nusra is like the strike force of, I think, in many ways, of the Syrian opposition. And they're being funded because the mainline opposition was hung out to dry, largely by the United States and other powers as well. And I think you can, this is borne out in, whether you have a conversation with the Syrian opposition or the deliberations between the United States and even the Europeans. And what's happened is that in looking at the current situation, they decided that and I think here we're looking at private individuals providing assistance to JN. JN is a self-sustaining organization in many ways. Accounts of JN and our colleague Aaron Zellin has written about this as well. Groups like Ahrar Sham and Sequoia Sham, which serve as the basis for the Syrian Islamic Front and the Syrian Liberation Front, respectively. They overrun a base with weapons and assistance that were provided from outside. They get all the weapons that were in that base, including shoulder-fired anti-aircraft systems, and then they go on and use those weapons to hit other targets. Now, interestingly, though, and I think this is really important, the accounts of what happened at Ras Al Ain, the attacks that were carried out across the border from Turkey by extremist forces against the Kurds, though, does indicate the knowledge or a wink and a nod by Turkey in terms of their activities. And the reason why I think this is strange in my mind, and I'm not throwing blame out here, but military intelligence, Turkish military intelligence, extremely strong. They're extremely capable organization. I just don't think stuff like that flows across the border and groups like that move across the border unless they know it. Remember, this happened in the context of a tremendous amount of frustration among regional parties, regional countries, that the United States was not backing the opposition, was not arming it. So therefore, there could be a tendency in some circles to back extremist forces. But exactly what that means, I don't know. And here, I think penetration into how that works it would be very hard with any kind of reliability.
Gentlemen? Simon? Okay. I'm David Pollock. Yes, coming right to you.
Thanks. I'm Dave Pollock here at the Institute. I wanted to ask about the refugee outflow, which is expanded very greatly, and I guess you had personal experience with some of the camps. So the question is, are the overwhelming majority of the refugees now still women, children, and old men? And the reason that I ask that is not just for humanitarian reasons, but also, is there some sense you can derive from that about how the overall military balance is shaping up? Are Syrian men running away from the border provinces in larger numbers? And if so, does that indicate, and this is the impression that I got overall from your presentations, does that indicate that the momentum that seemed to be going in favor of the opposition a month or two or three ago has now shifted the other way, or at least is sort of equal between the opposition and the regime?
I picked up a sinus infection out there, and my ears still haven't adjusted to the airplane trips. In the camp, I saw, my image is a lot of military age males floating around. Right, the place is an enormous baby factory, right, or incubator for, children. There's a bazillion kids, of all ages, lots of women, lots of old people, but also a lot of men. It didn't strike me that the camp was, empty of, adult, young adults or adult males at all. What does it say about the state of the war or the balance, between the regime and the rebels? I don't know exactly. It's a good question, but it means one, that those people aren't available for the regime to call up and integrate into reserve units or whatever. But it also means they're not eager to join the rebel side, right? Because they're kind of hanging out there. There's another camp that was like 20 kilometers or so away from the Zatari camp. That's all military defectors, right? So I think they said there were 7,000, people in there. So okay, what are those guys doing? I mean, why aren't they in the in the FSA? So it indicates a lot of people are hedging their bets, right? Or just don't want to get involved in this meat grinder of a conflict. The FSA loses a lot of people in combat, and so does the regime. So it's hard to draw broad conclusions based on that. But there are a lot of military eligible or age eligible guys there.
Jeff, could you say something about the question of the balance in the conflict between the regime and the opposition?
Yeah, sure. I was trying to avoid that, question. Okay. In my mind, I've been optimistic for the rebels, and I still think optimism is in order. I think they're winning the war. The metaphor I would use is like the rebels are like rising water, right? They're going up in capabilities, and the regime is shrinking to islands of control. Some of those are big islands, like in the coastal area, but they're not completely. The water's rising there, at least in northern, Latakia. But in the rest of the country, the water's definitely rising, and we see the regime's area of control shrinking. We see continued attrition of regime forces. See the increase in capabilities in rebel forces, especially anti-tank capabilities. The Croatian so-called Croatian arms deal, but also in terms of anti-aircraft capabilities. I haven't crunched the numbers because I was out in the field and now back here, but I will. But it certainly looks like the numbers of regime aircraft that are being shot down are increasing. And the Air Force is a wasting asset for the regime. It's not getting any new platforms, not getting any new aircraft. So every aircraft that's shot down is one less that it has. And based on estimated operational rates, it did not have a lot to start with. So that asset is declining. The Croatian arms deal and captures of weapons from regime forces have given the rebels an increased anti-tank capability, which you can see being employed every day. And the heavy armor of the regime is also a wasting asset. When they lose a tank, there's no more tank. Right, that's one down. And they're losing, some number of armored vehicles every single day, in the fight. The Army looks to be hollowed out. The units don't look to be up to strength. The numbers of defenders of some of these major installations that have fallen look to actually be pretty small. Maybe a couple hundred people defending a major airfield or a significant airfield, not thousands defending it. And there's this transfer of as I mentioned earlier, the transfer of military responsibilities to irregular and auxiliary forces. That speaks to the hollowing out of the Army. So the rebels got lots of problems, for sure. They're not an ideal force, but there's a whole bunch of them, all over the place. And they're getting better at fighting. And I think you can see it all the time.
And how about right there?
Thank you. Abe Shulsky from Hudson Institute. I was wondering if any of you could comment on what's going on in the Kurdish area. You mentioned the attack across the border from Turkey, but on the issue of whether there's been any real progress made in unifying the various Kurdish groups so that they could try to keep control of an area and basically stay neutral is what they seem to have wanted to do. But, they've been divided between the PYD and the other groups. I was just wondering if you had any sense of what was going on there.
We did not specifically look at the Kurdish areas, but what we could glean from our conversations and what came up in various areas. No, there is not a formal agreement among the Kurdish groups but there is a sort of, how would I say it? They have general fears about the overall Arab, what they feel Arab-dominated opposition. So therefore, they're carving out this sort of third way in which they are preserving control over the areas in which they are prevalent, especially as the regime gives way. They're increasingly caught, though, and I think this is where the Ras Al Ain incident comes up, between the Syrian opposition and Turkey as well. And there's a lot of effort, or there's a lot of feeling that they are therefore caught between these two between these two forces, and a lot of indecision about what to do. There was quite a bit of talk about Iranian support for the PKK, and how much that would come at the cost of current Turkish negotiations or talks with the PKK itself, and the ongoing dialogue there. And that's as specific as I can answer it.
And over here. Microphone up front, please.
Amal Modelleli with Mr. Hariri. I have two quick questions. The first one is about Israel. You did not tell us what is the thinking of Israel, how to deal with the situation on the Golan Heights. Especially, there were some reports that they were thinking about a wall at one point. So what is the thinking? How do they think they're going to contain the situation if they sense this is the biggest challenge? The second one, there's a report today, I think in the Washington Post, that the administration is debating extending the authority of using the drones to fight the offshoots of Al-Qaeda, and they mention Jabhat al-Nusra. What do you think of this, and don't you think this will change the focus of this war from an transition in Syria to an anti-terrorism campaign? Thank you.
I think the Israelis are obviously concerned, and it was communicated to us about what's going on across from them on the Golan. They see the area disintegrating because the order in the area disintegrating because the regime forces there have been withdrawn or ineffective or engaged in some kind of on and off skirmishing with the rebels. The area between say Sasa and the Undorf disengagement line is becoming kind of no man's land, unruled territory, which is just fought over, so not randomly exactly, but episodically by the local guerrillas and the kind of decaying regime, forces in the region. The Israelis, I don't think, are concerned so much about, the fact that these radical groups might start shooting rockets into their territory or trying to infiltrate. They think basically, at least for now, they have their hands full with the regime forces, pushing their agenda inside Syria. They're not focused on Israel. For the longer term, I think the Israelis are thinking about barrier systems, enhanced barrier systems to prevent infiltration. And the Israelis, the IDF has got a heck of a lot of experience in dealing with, infiltration, rockets, those kinds of things. So they see that as an emergent threat, but not something that they don't know how to deal with or can't deal with. This didn't come up, but maybe a bigger problem for them might be big refugee flows. Like if the battle for Damascus really gets on and people start, taking to their feet and looking for security, if thousands of people headed for the Golan looking for safety, that might be a problem. It'd be harder for them to deal with in a sense than in a military, than a strict military kind of problem that they're familiar with. On the idea of using drones against JN strikes me as if not insanity, just kind of totally wacky. Let's say right, less than insanity, but not really. Wouldn't be a logical or approach, especially at this time, right? JN in a sense is doing the Lord's work and it's trying to help bring down the regime, and it's one of the most effective forces in bringing down the regime. But more importantly, the Syrian people don't see JN as bad. They see JN in many ways as heroes of the revolution because of their willingness to fight, their willingness to take casualties. They don't get this U.S. designation. They don't get that the U.S. has it in for them. They see that JN is fighting, for the cause of the Syrian revolution. So attacking JN, doing the regime's work, at this time strikes me as kind of utterly, inconsistent with reality, or whatever. It just it doesn't make any kind of sense. They haven't attacked us, so on and so on.
Let me piggyback on that with another question of my own, which is we've really talked very little about the perceptions of the United States on the part of the various interlocutors you had. And I'd be interested in hearing more from each of you about what is the perception of the people you were speaking with about U.S. policy in Syria? What do they see as our objectives? And how effective do they think that we have been at advancing those objectives? And what are their concerns?
I'll start this one off, but I personally want to hear the answer from my colleagues as well. As I said in my piece, the U.S. officials I talked to, Syria was just one part of the concerns, the other being Iran, what was going on in Egypt. There was a real sense that there were differences between the U.S. and the Gulf countries on these issues. The U.S. was clearly upset that the Gulf countries were supporting jihadi groups in Syria, and the U.S. Was upset that the Gulf countries, other than Qatar, were unhappy with the Morsi government in Egypt. The Gulf countries themselves, their basic excuse was twofold: either what is U.S. policy, or in the absence of, we don't see U.S. policy, but we would like a little bit of U.S. leadership, and we don't see U.S. leadership either.
To directly, to echo what Simon's last point, I think almost straight across the board, the lack of U.S. leadership came up. I hate to throw out phrases like that unless you sort of explain what they mean. So I would ask them, I said, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, I think the thing that baffles Syria's neighbors, as well as I think the Syrian opposition as well, is the continued idea that somehow this is containable, or the word here we use in policy circles is sort of cauterized from within, at the same time that by every indicator this conflict is getting worse. And I think I was particularly heartened by what I heard in Israel about an increased worry about and concentration on the Syria crisis. I think the Israelis know that the White House does not want to deal more effectively with Syria. I think that though behind the scenes they're very worried because they have to live next to it. And because the country is melting down in many sense, in almost every sense, I think, there was a worry about, quite frankly, what would come not just after Assad, but how you would manage that. Because the realist school, I think, looks at this as, well, you can deal with it kinetically. You can use a drone, or in some Israeli circles you could fire across the border. But that's not going to take care of what's the font, which is giving birth to this new Syria, which is increasingly outside of the ability for the United States and its allies to deal with. The real risk, I think, and the real worry, and this is where the president's statements on the Congo and why not intervene in Syria when I have to decide when I'm going to intervene in Congo as well. Well, I think that most of Syria's neighbors were rather insulted. It's not because they thought that they were necessarily the big boys in the block, although sometimes I think they are. It's because, of course, Syria is much more geographically central to U.S. national security interests, and they were quite challenged by this. So I think that though there is just a general disconnect between the way it's. If you have to deal with the Syrian revolution as it is, if you have to deal with Syrians, you have to deal with the things that go along with it, you have one point of view. And I think this point of view, more assertive action, is borne out by the most recent articles that we've seen come out about the positions of the Defense Department and the State Department about Syria policy. The idea that somehow it's getting better, that a political solution is more likely, that somehow it'll calm down, cauterize itself from within, or whatever, is just not there. And I think that's where most officials that I spoke with, as well as individuals, they just could not get it. They couldn't see why the United States couldn't see it. In many cases, I think they had just thrown up their hands, tossed their lots in with other forces in the region, and decided to continue the fight on their own.
And in back, sir.
İlhan Tanır from Turkish Press. Two quick questions. One is that a lot of people have been arguing about the fragmentation of Syria going forward. My question is, if we think, as many people expect, that Aleppo is going to fall next 2 months or 8 months, how the Damascus, you think, can tolerate this constant harassment by the rebels that now they have been situated in suburbs of Damascus for so long? So my question is, do you think it's possible fragmentation considering the situation of Damascus? And the second question is, again, many people have been asking me about the Aleppo. Andrew, you talk about the capability of Turkish military, and people are asking why the Turkish military cannot help more these rebels in terms of coordination, in terms of more intel or the operations. It just looks like it takes a lot longer for rebels to take over or overrun different Syrian bases than it's supposed to. Thank you.
Sure. On the fragmentation question, I think if I got it right, is I think fragmentation is highly likely. That's in my view, that's the number one scenario, is that Syria will be dismantled, sort of province by province or locality by locality, and Damascus falls into that category. There's a lot of fighting in and around Damascus, kind of all the time. It's not some sort of area that the regime holds securely now. There's fighting, near the center of Damascus even today, and there's lots and lots of fighting in the Rif Damascus, especially east and south of the city. So Damascus is going to be part of that fragmentation. Why doesn't Aleppo fall quicker? Part of it, a lot of it relates to let's say two things, right? One is the rebels have a lot of forces in the area. We were told 15,000 fighters and a total of 40,000 overall involved in the battle for Aleppo. 15,000 armed and active in that fight. So there are a lot of fighters there. But the issue is, coordination of forces, the massing of forces, the allocation of heavy weapons, and the ability to supply those forces so they can maintain a sustained effort against the key installations in the city. We saw a couple weeks ago a drive for Nairab Airport, Aleppo International, that basically petered out, probably because of lack of ammunition, more than anything else. The other thing is the regime has made a pretty sustained effort to hold on to at least part of Aleppo, beginning last summer. And the regime's got maybe 6,000 or more forces in the area. We were told combination of regular forces and Shabiha. They've tried to reinforce the area. They tried to open up a supply route, a ground supply route to the area recently, and looked like they were successful. So part of the reason Aleppo is going slowly is because the regime's fighting hard there, within its means, bombing a lot, using a lot of artillery, and using a lot of Scud, type missiles. So, it's war, right? It's not linear. It goes up and down.
And right here, please.
Thank you very much. I just would like to make 3 brief comments about Mr. Tabler's presentation, and then I will forward questions both to Mr. Tabler and Mr. White. I agree with Mr. Tabler on the difference between the view in United States and the view in, oh, by the way, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Burcardo from the Turkish Embassy. This is why I felt the urge to make comments. The view from the US and the view from the neighboring countries is pretty much different. You're right, you rightly pointed that. It's different because the neighboring countries feel the pressure of the conflict. And for us, it's not just a minor problem, an internal problem happening in our next border, but a major issue that threatens international peace and security and also poses a great challenge to the international community because of the major humanitarian challenge it poses. This is the first issue that I would like to touch upon. And the second thing is that you said the discussion in Ankara has shifted, and there is a request for more US leadership in the Syrian crisis. As a matter of fact, this is not just the expectation of Ankara. This is an expectation raised in international fora. The majority of the international community is looking for United States involvement and interference in the issue because of the major responsibility of the United States as a member of the UN Security Council, being part of the UN P5 membership. Since right now the United Nations is, totally becoming irrelevant on the issue, particularly the UN Security Council, and there is an urgent need on behalf of both the US and the other P5 members to act urgently on this issue. And the US has the power on Russia to influence Russia and to pressure Russia to change its position. The third issue about the al-Nusra Front and the increased radicalization in Syria. As a matter of fact, this is a concern we share in Turkey as well, since we share the same vision of United States for the future of Syria, and also we share the same vision with the international community and, more importantly, with the people of Syria. But as long as this conflict goes on, prolongs, the ethno-sectarian fault lines will get deeper and deeper in Syria. And right now, we don't see a radicalized Syria, since the Syrian people, contrary to the other Arab people in the region, are actually very moderate, and they are Mediterranean more than Middle Eastern. But if this conflict goes on, there is the high risk of increased radicalization. And regarding Turkey's, your allegation concerning Turkey's support to al-Nusra Front, Turkey does not support al-Nusra Front, and we are talking about a border which is 911 kilometers long. And if we, base our presumptions on the capabilities of intelligence organizations, then I think, that would not be fair to say such a thing, because even the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States might sometimes not be able to deter threats that are faced against its citizens. My question to Mr. Tabler is, what do you think in terms of Secretary Kerry's recent statements to change the calculations of Assad? What do you think? What are the factors that can change the calculations of Assad? Based on your, observations from the region. And my question to Mr. White is concerning al-Nusra Front. You said that the al-Nusra Front is a major component of the opposition groups in Syria. Can you give us any numbers about, how big this group is, and how do you consider the timing of the designation of al-Nusra Front as a terrorist organization, while the opposition fighters, involved in a struggle against the regime, who claims is, fighting against terrorists? Thank you very much.
Thanks for that. I am not alleging that Ankara is supporting Jabhat al-Nusra. What I am saying, though, is that MIT is strong in southern Turkey, and I think it knows what's going on there, and I think it's feeling the heat, I think, as well as the Turkish government, about how things are going in the Syrian revolution. And I understand that sometimes things can get out of hand, and I don't have the smoking gun on this one. But I think that conflict, though, came up time and time again in our discussions there, and I think it would be unfair for me not to mention it. And what the ultimate, what happened at Ras Al Ain, I think, is something that will be very interesting to see what reports come out since that time. I'm not unsympathetic to the Turkish view, I think, as everybody here knows, and I think my conversations in Turkey and in Ankara bear that out. Overall, I think looking at the, I totally agree with your points concerning that looking at American obligations going forward. I think that what has happened, and one of the things that complicates this, is that covert policy is driving what is going on in Syria and dealing with it. And the Obama administration would rather that our overt policy be one of dealing with the Syrian coalition in public, and trying to seek a negotiated solution as well in public, while waging a private war against the Assad regime. But it's therefore a very limited war, and one that doesn't ultimately solve Turkey's problems. And I think Turkey is very right, along with its other neighbors, Israel as well as Jordan, and as I think also parties in Lebanon as well, about the continued spillover from that conflict. So I think that hopefully can address most of your question there. I think what was particularly, I was told a number of times when I was in Turkey that the Turkish parties were told that the reason for military intervention, I think this gets to your question as well, the reason for military intervention and a constraint on what it could do is because they wanted the assistance that was going to the rebels to be more covert. That they didn't want it to be an overt policy. And again, this is my major point going back, is that providing, I'm sorry to say this and be so blunt, but providing Band-Aids and Happy Meals to the Syrian armed opposition is not going to bring down Assad. Let's be honest, okay? That is not going to be enough to bring down Assad. It's not going to be enough to arrest a failed state in Syria, all right? Much more assertive action is going to be necessary in order to arrest that trend. And the big problem is that we can't lead an overall political, what we're looking at here is a political operation using military means, okay? We can provide them with weapons. Other parties can provide them with weapons. But we're trying to deal with a post-Assad Syria here. It is a political operation by necessity. You can't carry out a political operation through the intelligence services. Why? Because everything is secret and no one can understand what the hell we're doing. That is the major confusion over U.S. policy. I think we are doing a lot of things off in the shadows. I think that also our allies are as well. But you can't follow what you don't understand. And meanwhile, you don't get any credit for it. So the Syrian opposition thinks it's Jabhat al-Nusra and all the other Gulf parties who are actually taking down Assad, when actually I think the United States and its allies are doing a fair bit themselves. So it's time to step up that activity and to make it more overt so that everybody can understand it.
Jeff, a last word?
On the size of the JN on this front, I have no idea. We were given a figure by one analyst out there of 10,300. Okay, is that reasonable figure or not? I don't know. I know that JN is active in maybe 8 of the provinces: Dar ez-Zor, Hasaka, Raqqa, Idlib, Aleppo, Homs, Damascus, and Dara. I think that comes to 8, maybe not. But it's active at least in those provinces. But it operates kind of on a franchise basis, right? There's an emir for each province or even a local area, and trying to penetrate into what's the substructure, organization, and manning of JN is not something that I'm able to do or that I've seen anybody else able to do real well. So numbers are unclear. I think what's more important than their numbers is their willingness to fight, and the fact that they're so active in the fighting, that they're so present at all the major battles. Sometimes they serve as the organizing element for the battles. That is, they take control and more or less run a specific battle in the country. On the designation issue and the timing of it, all I can say is I don't have any clear idea, why that was done. It didn't make sense to me. I didn't see any real need why we had to do that. I didn't get the timing, the timing of it, and that's all I could say. In my mind, it was a mistake.
Well, thank you very much. This was a well-timed event, and we look forward to discussing this issue again in the future.